Revolutions. Where does the modern-day supply chain come from? In other words, at the end of which process did developed countries begin to have their t-shirts made on the other side of the world? In order to understand the process, let's travel back in history, from revolution to evolution. Remember that the wealth of Western countries was created as a result of a revolution, the Industrial Revolution. Industry was born around big factories, which were mostly built in areas where raw materials and energy sources were present. Technical and economic progress quickly led to an increase in the number of factories that needed significant manpower for work in mining, the textile or metallurgical industries, chemistry, mechanics, etc. An increase in population and productivity gains in agriculture, which would lead to a massive rural exodus and the creation of a labour pool. Thus, large masses of able-bodied people looking for work in order to survive and escape misery, and captains of industry looking for manpower to keep their factories running, found themselves in the same place at the same time. Initially, workers from uprooted populations found in this at least a way to survive. The profits, which were considerable and massively reinvested, resulted in significant rates of economic growth, which led to increasingly radical changes to society. Inequalities grew constantly, eventually becoming unjustifiable. On the one hand, vast fortunes, and on the other hand, harsh living and working conditions and insecurity. In this context of economic growth, which increased available wealth, inequality began to be seen as an injustice, and the workers began to protest. They organized themselves into unions to protect their interests as a group. The political and social struggle was fierce and all too often violent. It is worth noting the many similarities with the situation and evolution of numerous countries around the world as they became industrialized. Poor workers flee the misery of the countryside and head to the cities in the hopes of finding a job, increasingly striking inequalities. Worker attempts to organize themselves are actively and sometimes violently thwarted by economic leaders with political power. Reproduction. We have seen how, over the course of 2 centuries, bosses became public limited liability companies and workers consumers. But we have yet to discuss the origins of the need to extend supply and subcontracting chains, at the end of which disasters often occur, as we saw earlier. In fact, when companies relocate production, they are actually just reproducing an old system. Memories are all that remain of certain companies which were once considered emblematic, indestructible and everlasting, and yet disappeared. Some, such as Compaq, which became a sub-brand of HP, or Chrysler, which was bought out by Mercedes and then Fiat, were taken over by more powerful and more daring competitors after being among the leaders in their industry. Others simply disappeared after a lengthy struggle because they were unable to adapt, Pan Am, Thomson, or reach critical size. Who remembers the world's second largest IT company in the 1970s, the Digital Equipment Corporation, also known as DEC or Digital, before it was taken over by Compaq, which was created in 1982? Others, such as Lehman Brothers or Enron, collapsed when certain executives, unbeknownst to shareholders who were either complacent or manipulated due to their anonymity, lost control and cheated to conceal their failures and accounting fraud. We must never forget that, although they might not have a soul, companies certainly can die, and many of them regularly put their own survival at stake. Yet companies constantly have important choices to make, and they are at the point of convergence of the expectations of many stakeholders in their economic, financial or political environment. All of these stakeholders defend their own, usually highly justified, interests and have different means of exerting pressure. What are their various expectations? Shareholders expect the money they invest to be used properly and safely. They either ask for dividends or they expect the company to have a growth strategy in place in order to make more profits. In any case, investments need to be made and these need to be financed, which is why extra money is needed. Where does this money come from? It can either come from profit that is reinvested, but in this case dividends are not paid out, or it can come from capital increases, but in this case profits must increase in order to make the injection of new capital profitable and thus make new investments. These simultaneous expectations of liquidity, profitability, and safety are legitimate, but it is sometimes necessary to leverage all financial engineering resources in order to satisfy them. From an ethical point of view, such practices are not always without risk or consequences. Customers, need we remind you, are generally rather demanding and have more power when they have access to more information and more choices. In this age of the citizen consumer, the internet, trade globalisation, and competition law, we understand that consumers have many tools at their disposal to voice their point of view. But what are consumer expectations when it comes to suppliers? Consumers expect the following all at once: better quality and performance, a guarantee, to be constantly tempted by new products, immediate availability of products, choices, or in other words products that are mass-produced yet varied and also personalized if possible, the cheapest price. These expectations are also legitimate, but it is not always easy to satisfy them all at the same time. Although consumers are customers who always want the best value for their money, they are still workers who want as much money as possible for their time and work. Workers who are collectively represented and defended by trade unions and other legal employee representative bodies want the companies they work for to give them the highest remuneration possible. And actually, expectations from employers go well beyond immediate remuneration, since companies contribute to their employees' vacations, health insurance, pensions, and unemployment benefits. Again, these expectations are normal and legitimate, and it is mostly because industrialized countries could satisfy these expectations that they truly became more peaceful, wealthy, and democratic. Note 2 consequences in passing. An overall increase in wages in the long term is only possible through an increase in productivity. Pressure is then put on the workers themselves, as the companies they work for expect growing levels of productivity to justify wages. This has led to the appearance of psychosocial risks in industrialized countries. These expectations are sometimes conflicting since they generate costs which are necessarily reflected in the retail prices of products, and the consumers, who are themselves workers in the company, are not always too happy about this. Is it worth going into more detail about the pressure which competition, i.e. other companies, places on companies? All over the world, competition is now considered to be an element of economic public order and, through competition law, is governed by a meticulous and restrictive legal framework. The competition authorities monitor the markets closely and sanctions are increasingly frequent and heavy. However, the public authorities protect competition itself, not competitors. In such circumstances, companies which are not competitive enough are destined for failure, sometimes even in the short term. Yet, in our globalized world, competitors are not all subject to the same constraints or pressure. Consequently, they do not have the same cost structures. Finally, as a consequence of all pressure and constraints which companies are subject to, often accompanied by pure unscrupulous greed, the least productive tasks, which are very often the most laborious and require the least qualifications, can no longer be performed by workers in developed countries due to economic reasons. So companies must either import cheap labor to rich countries, which quickly creates political problems, as everyone knows that the rich don't always like to share. Efforts are thus made to limit legal immigration, but the solution remains highly appealing, which is why Nepalese workers can be found in Qatar or Saudi Arabia, Africans in Europe, and illegal Mexican workers in the US. Or relocate production to where cheap labor is available. It is the combination of all these elements that creates the need to extend supply and subcontracting chains. And everything is set up in such a way that stakeholders, financial institutions, customers, employees, companies, governments, who consider their expectations and needs as justified, take no responsibility for the consequences, believing themselves innocent in the face of any disasters that occur. When the time comes to make choices, Western companies draw up an inventory of their activities and any associated constraints. This generally leads to the following conclusion, with some variations depending on the nature of the jobs and local conditions. Companies focus on their main business activity and outsource support and ancillary functions such as cleaning, maintenance of premises and some equipment, staff catering, transport, and sometimes IT, payroll, and purchasing. Many of these jobs are subcontracted to local businesses because they cannot be relocated. Companies demand the lowest prices from them. Then they think hard about the value chain within the business activity itself. It often appears that, depending on the business activity itself, the power of the company often resides in their knowledge of the markets and therefore in marketing expertise, in the research and development of products and new techniques and therefore in research, development and engineering, in their ownership of intellectual property, trademarks and patents, in their production capacity, in their ability to organize themselves and therefore in the logistics chain, in quality control and therefore in the final assembly and verifications, in their access to raw materials, in their access to sources of financing and therefore in financial engineering. Resources and talents should therefore focus on those important points. In this list, 2 tasks can be subcontracted, but only if the company masters all the others: the sourcing of raw materials, the production capacity, or in other words, the production itself. However, in many business activities, production presents characteristics that push companies to subcontract. It requires a large quantity of workers, especially low-skilled workers, who can provide a satisfactory level of quality if they are supervised and are taught the right techniques and methods. It requires investments and therefore consumes resources which are rare or expensive and better used elsewhere. But there is one fact we must not forget. Never in all of history have transport costs been so cheap. Whether we are transporting information, transferring money, transporting tourists or businessmen to the other side of the world by plane, or transporting goods by truck, train, plane or boat, the cost is currently a pittance. We even bring fresh fruit from Africa and Latin America to Europe, where they arrive processed, packaged, transported, taxed, and are then distributed to local grocery stores without their price becoming excessively high. The best evidence of this is that people buy them. It is this extreme productivity of the transport industry that makes what we call globalisation possible. As a result, where activities are performed becomes less and less important, and it is now possible to source industrial and agricultural raw materials on the other side of the world and transfer production capacities over there too. Reproductions. But a big problem arises. How is it possible from a tower in Paris, Tokyo or New York for companies to contact and recruit poor workers who live in a different world, a different culture, and do not even speak basic business English? In Central Europe, when the Berlin Wall fell, In China, India, and Africa, there are many workers looking for work in order to escape poverty and at least be able to feed their children. But the two worlds, the world of enterprise and that of uprooted workers on the other side of the world, cannot exist side by side, let alone meet. Intermediaries are therefore needed, and it is here, in this mixture of anonymity, clear conscience, willful blindness, unlimited irresponsibility, greed, cynicism, and corruption, that disasters can occur, and we notice the reproduction of a pattern we've already witnessed in Western countries. Well-informed and enterprising wealthy people getting rich at the expense of the poor. The more the cultural or geographical distance between the ordering party and the one doing the work is great, the longer the chain of middlemen, suppliers, subcontractors, and local recruitment agencies will be. But in the feverish hunt for cheap prices and therefore ever lower costs, each intermediary needs to make a profit in order to survive and will therefore seek out a cheaper subcontractor that has goods manufactured in countries where workers are less protected. Subcontracting itself isn't a problem. The longer the chain of intermediaries is, the less it can be controlled and the more it is likely to encourage mafia-like methods, corruption, and predatory behavior. Moreover, the longer the supply and subcontracting chains are, the more poor workers, illegal immigrants, displaced or barracked workers will be exploited in situations of forced labor, sometimes nearing slavery, because it becomes impossible, given the number of middlemen and the pressure to keep the retail price of the end product low, to ensure that workers at the end of the chain get paid decent wages.